Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The Unexpected Journey. Captain Marcus Johnson sat in the plush seat of the first-class cabin, a rare luxury he rarely experienced from the passenger side. As the rest of the world hurried past him, busy settling into their seats, Marcus relaxed into the deep leather cushion, a sigh escaping his lips. The air was cool, a welcome relief from the stifling heat of New York's summer. Today, he was just a man on a flight, not the authoritative captain in the cockpit, commanding the skies. He'd earned this moment, a small respite from the daily grind of overseeing a flight. But now, with a rare chance to sit back and enjoy the comforts of first-class travel, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. From the trials of flight school to the numerous hurdles he'd overcome to become one of the few black pilots in commercial aviation, every moment had been an uphill battle. But today was different. Today was for him. He had worked hard to earn this ticket, this seat, and he was determined to savor it. His mind drifted as he picked up his well-worn copy of The Right Stuff, a book that had been a constant companion during his own journey through the aviation world. It was a fitting choice for a flight to Los Angeles, a city that had long held the dreams of so many aspiring pilots, writers, actors, and dreamers of all kinds. As the passengers around him continued to settle into their seats, Marcus could feel their curious gazes upon him. He had learned to ignore them over the years, but even in 2024, being a black man in first class remained a rare sight. He had been the subject of many sideways glances, quiet whispers, and even outright stares, and though it should have been normal by now, it wasn't. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft shuffle of footsteps. A flight attendant, a petite woman with a bright but seemingly practiced smile, approached him. Her name tag read, Sarah. Her eyes briefly scanned the cabin before landing on Marcus. He smiled politely, nodding to acknowledge her presence, expecting the usual greeting, "What would you like to drink?" or "Can I offer you some snacks?" However, Sarah's smile faltered ever so slightly as she came to a stop beside his seat. She glanced down at the boarding pass in her hand, and Marcus could tell something was off. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice steady, but tinged with an unfamiliar note of hesitation. "I believe there's been a mistake with your seating assignment. Could I please see your boarding pass?" Marcus blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" he asked, his hand instinctively reaching for his ticket. It was supposed to be a simple exchange, a routine check, nothing more. Sarah took the boarding pass from him, her eyes quickly scanning it as she muttered something under her breath. The usual politeness was gone, replaced with a furrowed brow. Her eyes flickered nervously around the cabin, as though searching for something, or perhaps someone. It was clear this wasn't just a mistake with his seat assignment, it was something more. "I'm sorry, sir," she said again, her voice a little firmer now, but with an undertone of discomfort. "This ticket is for first class, but I'm afraid we're out of first class seats. I'm going to need you to move to the economy section." Marcus felt a sharp stab of confusion, followed by a strange wave of disbelief. He'd been a passenger on countless flights, and his ticket had always been clear. "I'm afraid I don't understand," he replied, keeping his voice calm and steady. "This is my assigned seat. It says so on the boarding pass." His fingers twitched, ready to point out the discrepancy. This was, after all, his seat. His rightful seat. But he knew better than to escalate things. Sarah's smile was now strained, forced. She had no intention of backing down. "Sir, I'm afraid you must have misunderstood," she said, her tone becoming just a bit patronizing. "This section is specifically reserved for our premium passengers. I'm sure you can understand the confusion, given your appearance." The words hung in the air, weighted with implications. In that moment, it was clear to Marcus what was really happening. She hadn't even asked him to confirm his seat before making assumptions. The words appearance and premium felt more like an accusation than an explanation. He wasn't just being asked to move, he was being told, in no uncertain terms, that someone like him didn't belong in a place like this. Marcus could feel his chest tighten as the familiar sting of injustice washed over him. It was a feeling he thought he had buried long ago, after years of overcoming barriers to become a pilot. But here it was again, staring him in the face, a direct challenge to his place in the world, to his worth, to everything he had worked for. Remaining calm, he took a deep breath and locked eyes with Sarah. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what's going on here, but this is my seat. I've earned this seat. If you'd like to check with your supervisor, I'm happy to wait." Sarah's eyes darted nervously around the cabin. Her smile had completely disappeared, replaced by an expression of thinly veiled irritation. "I am the lead flight attendant on this flight," she said, her voice becoming sharper. "And I'm asking you, kindly, to gather your things and move to the economy section. There are other passengers waiting, and I need this seat for its intended occupant." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Marcus could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, some with curiosity, others with discomfort, and a few who simply seemed to be waiting for the situation to escalate. He had been in this position before, more times than he cared to count, and he knew what the right thing to do was. The right thing was to stay calm, keep his dignity, and not allow the situation to become more heated than it already was. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose his composure. "Very well," Marcus said, his voice steady but tight, his emotions simmering just beneath the surface. "I'll move. But I'd like to speak with the captain about this before we take off." Sarah's expression shifted, her eyes flickering with a mix of relief and irritation. "Of course, sir," she said quickly. "I'm sure the captain will be happy to explain our seating policies to you." She turned to walk away, her high heels clicking sharply against the floor as she left Marcus to gather his things. As he stood to move, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was far from over. It wasn't just about a seating mix-up. It wasn't even about him being asked to move from first class to economy. It was about something deeper, a challenge to his worth as a person, as a professional. It was about how his identity, his skin, was seen as a threat to the order that others expected. As Marcus made his way toward the back of the plane, heading for the cramped, less luxurious economy section, he couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. How many times had he been underestimated, judged, and dismissed because of the color of his skin? How many more times would he have to prove himself before people saw beyond their prejudices? But he wasn't going to let this moment break him. Not now. Not ever. As Marcus settled into the narrow economy seat, the contrast was stark, first class with its comfort and spaciousness, now replaced by the hustle and bustle of the overcrowded cabin. But it wasn't the seat that mattered. It was what came next. And Marcus knew that he wasn't about to let Sarah's assumptions, or the assumptions of anyone else on this plane, define him. This was just the beginning. The beginning of a moment that would change everything. A teachable moment. The economy section felt like a different world compared to the luxurious first-class cabin Marcus had just vacated. The seat was smaller, cramped even, and the passengers around him were not as composed as those in first class. It was a cacophony of sounds, overhead bins being shut with a thud, the shuffle of passengers trying to stow their bags, the murmur of low conversations, and Marcus couldn't help but feel a subtle sense of discomfort. Not from the confined space, but from the unjust reality that had led him here. As he settled in, his mind replayed the interaction with Sarah, the flight attendant who had forced him to move, based solely on an assumption of where he belonged. It wasn't the first time he had encountered prejudice. In fact, it felt all too familiar, a painful reminder of the years he'd spent earning his place in a profession that was not always welcoming to people who looked like him. But today, this wasn't just a matter of personal frustration, this was something bigger. This was an opportunity to challenge not just Sarah's assumptions, but the assumptions of every person on this plane. Marcus had always believed in turning moments of injustice into opportunities for growth, for education, for change. It was a philosophy he had carried with him throughout his career, and today, he would use his voice. It was no longer just about fighting for his right to sit in first class, it was about making sure that others, passengers and crew alike, understood the deeper significance of his presence, not just on this flight, but in the world. He gazed around the cabin, taking in the sight of the other passengers. There were families heading to Los Angeles for a vacation, businessmen with their laptops open, some weary travelers who seemed ready to sleep the moment the plane took off. He noticed a woman in the row ahead of him glancing at him curiously, then quickly looking away, her eyes shifting nervously. Marcus felt her discomfort, but he didn't let it affect him. He had learned long ago that the discomfort people felt wasn't his burden to carry. It was their problem to work through, not his. The hum of the plane's engines began to grow louder as the final passengers trickled into the cabin, and Marcus could feel the shift in the atmosphere. There was a sense of anticipation as the flight attendants prepared for takeoff. He couldn't help but notice that Sarah, the flight attendant, was still lingering in the aisle, her eyes darting toward him every few moments. She was clearly nervous, unsure of how to handle the situation now that the reality of her mistake had set in. As the last passenger settled into their seat, Sarah made her way down the aisle, speaking briefly with the flight attendant stationed at the rear of the plane. Her eyes met Marcus's once more, but this time, there was no attempt at a smile. Instead, there was a tense hesitation, as though she was trying to figure out how to rectify what had just happened without making herself look worse. Then, to Marcus's surprise, she approached him again. "Sir," she began, her voice low, as though trying to keep the conversation private. She still wore a professional expression, but it was clear she was struggling to maintain her composure. "I spoke with my supervisor. There was a misunderstanding earlier regarding your seat." Her tone was polite, but there was an underlying wariness in her voice. She wasn't apologizing, not yet, but she was at least acknowledging the error. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply handed her his boarding pass once more. His expression remained calm, but inside, he was beginning to formulate his response. He wasn't angry, not anymore. He had passed through the stage of frustration and moved into something far more productive. This wasn't a moment to let his emotions drive the conversation. This was a moment for clarity. A chance to educate. Sarah glanced down at the boarding pass in her hand, her fingers trembling slightly as she examined it once more. The frown on her face deepened as she continued to scrutinize the ticket, and Marcus could tell that this time, she was genuinely perplexed. The reality was undeniable, he had a valid first-class ticket. But it wasn't just the ticket that had caused this issue. It was something deeper. Something that went beyond the logistics of seating. I see," Sarah stammered, her eyes flicking up to meet his. "I'm so sorry, sir. It looks like there was indeed an error on our end." Marcus didn't say anything at first. He wanted her to continue, to let her try to make sense of the situation. But as he waited, his mind wandered to the bigger picture. This wasn't about a simple seating mix-up. It was about the assumptions people made based on skin color, about the biases that still lingered even in an age where equality was supposed to be the norm. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice steady but firm. "I appreciate the apology, but this goes beyond just a mistake with seating. I've been in this industry long enough to know when something isn't right. And I can't help but feel that my appearance was the reason I was asked to leave first class in the first place." Sarah's face flushed, and she quickly looked away, as if trying to avoid his gaze. There was an uncomfortable silence between them, the kind that spoke volumes. Marcus wasn't sure if she was embarrassed or just unsure of how to respond. But it didn't matter. He knew that now was the time to speak up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. "You see, Sarah," Marcus continued, his voice measured but full of purpose, "I've been a commercial pilot for over a decade. I've worked hard to get to where I am. But every time I step into a plane as a passenger, I'm reminded of how different it is for me compared to others. People don't always see my qualifications, they see the color of my skin first." He paused, giving her a moment to process his words. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the struggle between her professional demeanor and the undeniable truth he was speaking. "You don't know this, but I've spent years training, working, proving myself. I've had to fight for every opportunity, every inch of respect in this industry," Marcus went on. But this? This isn't about me. This is about every person who has ever been judged by the color of their skin or the way they look, instead of their character or their qualifications. This is a bigger issue than one seating assignment. Sarah's face softened, the tension in her posture slowly easing. For the first time since their conversation began, Marcus saw something resembling understanding in her eyes. But it wasn't just her that he needed to reach. It was everyone else on this plane, those passengers who had watched him move to the back of the cabin, those who had witnessed the exchange and felt uncomfortable but said nothing. This wasn't just a matter of one flight attendant's mistake, it was a moment that spoke to something much larger. Marcus took a deep breath and looked around at the passengers seated in the rows around him. I don't want an apology, Sarah. What I want is for people to see beyond the surface. I want them to understand that the real measure of a person isn't the seat they're assigned on an airplane, or the color of their skin, it's the quality of their character, the integrity they carry, and the work they put into everything they do. Sarah nodded slowly, her expression pensive. She seemed to be taking his words to heart, but Marcus knew that this was just one step in a much larger journey. He wasn't expecting change to happen overnight, but perhaps, just perhaps, this small conversation would be the spark that would challenge some of the assumptions that had led to this moment. As the plane's engines roared to life, signaling the beginning of the flight, Marcus leaned back in his seat, his gaze turning toward the window. He had done his part. He had spoken up. Now, all that was left was to see how the rest of the world would respond. Changing perspectives. The steady hum of the plane's engines was a constant reminder that they were now airborne, cutting through the clouds toward their destination. The smooth ascent was a welcome distraction from the tense conversation Marcus had just had with Sarah, but the weight of what had transpired hung heavily in the cabin. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers subtly on him, not in a judgmental way, but with an air of curiosity. He knew the flight would not be the same now, the dynamics of the cabin had shifted. But Marcus didn't mind. He wasn't here to make people uncomfortable. He was here to challenge their perceptions, to disrupt their notions of who belonged where. It was a lesson he had learned over his years as a pilot. Being comfortable with discomfort was often the first step toward breaking down barriers. He leaned back in his cramped seat, his mind racing. He had spoken his truth to Sarah, but there were still so many passengers on this plane who needed to hear it too. They had witnessed his removal from first class and his subsequent relocation to the economy section, and though some might have felt sympathy, Marcus knew it was a fleeting emotion. To make a lasting impact, the lesson had to come from within them. It wasn't enough to just stand up for himself, he needed to make sure they saw the injustice in the situation too. As the flight settled into a rhythm, with the occasional announcement from the flight attendants and the soft chatter of passengers around him, Marcus began to think about how to make that happen. He couldn't stand up and give a speech, of course, but perhaps there was another way to get the message across. He took a deep breath and glanced around the cabin. The atmosphere was quieter now. The initial excitement of boarding had worn off, and most passengers were either lost in their own thoughts or engrossed in their devices. It was then that he noticed the woman who had been watching him earlier. She was seated in the row ahead of him, her face partially obscured by her book, but her eyes kept flicking back to him. It was clear she had questions about what had just happened. Marcus decided to take the first step. He wasn't going to wait for someone else to break the silence. Gently, he tapped her on the shoulder. "Excuse me," he said in a calm, friendly tone. The woman jumped slightly, caught off guard by the interruption. She looked at him, her eyes wide, before quickly composing herself. "Oh, I'm sorry, did I?" No, it's fine," Marcus said with a reassuring smile. "I just noticed you were looking over here earlier, and I wanted to ask if you had any questions. I know the situation might have seemed unusual." The woman hesitated for a moment, then lowered her book, her curiosity evident. I did notice that," she admitted, her voice quiet. "I didn't understand what happened. You were in first class, and then," she paused, glancing down at her hands. "It just seemed odd. I mean, your ticket said first class, right?" Marcus nodded. Yes, it did. I'm a pilot, actually, Captain Marcus Johnson. I've been flying commercially for years. I was just trying to enjoy the flight as a passenger for once. But the flight attendant made an assumption about where I belonged, based on the way I look, not the ticket I had in hand. The woman's eyes widened in surprise. Wait, you're a pilot, she asked, her tone shifting from one of curiosity to genuine disbelief. But, why did she ask you to move? It's a good question, Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. It's not about the seating arrangement, not really. It's about the way people view me. The way people like me are viewed in society. I've spent my entire career proving myself, and yet, when I sit in first class as a passenger, the assumption is that I don't belong there. That's the reality of it. There was a long pause as the woman absorbed his words. Her expression shifted from confusion to a dawning understanding. Wow, she murmured, almost to herself. I never thought about it like that. I mean, I've heard of things like that happening, but I didn't realize it was so pervasive. Marcus nodded. It happens all the time. Not just in the airline industry, but everywhere. People make assumptions about others based on the way they look. It's part of the bias that still exists in society today. The hard part is that, when you've been fighting against that bias for years, you learn to pick up on it quickly. And you also learn to speak up. The woman was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on him as if processing everything he had said. Finally, she spoke again, her voice filled with conviction. I'm really glad you spoke up. I can't believe that happened to you. I'll be honest, I wouldn't have known how to react if I were in your shoes. Marcus smiled softly. That's the thing. A lot of people don't know how to react, and that's okay. But what matters is that we start talking about these things. If we don't speak up, how can we expect change? The woman nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. I think you're right. I'm sorry you had to go through that, but I'm glad you shared your perspective with me. Thank you, Marcus replied, his voice warm. It's not easy to have these conversations, but if we're going to make any progress, it starts with conversations like this. Before the woman could respond, Sarah, the flight attendant, appeared in the aisle again. This time, her demeanor was much more subdued, and there was a look of genuine remorse on her face. She approached Marcus carefully, her steps tentative as though she wasn't sure how to approach him after everything that had happened. Captain Johnson, she began, her voice quieter than before, I just wanted to personally apologize for what happened earlier. I've had some time to think about it, and I realize now that I made an assumption about you based on your appearance, and that was wrong. I'm truly sorry. Marcus looked up at her, his expression steady but not unkind. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, and that meant something. She wasn't just apologizing because she had to, she was apologizing because she understood the gravity of the situation. Thank you, Sarah, Marcus said, his voice calm. I appreciate the apology, and I'm glad to hear that you understand. It's not always easy to admit when we're wrong, but it's the first step toward real change. She nodded, a look of relief crossing her face. I'll make sure this never happens again, she added quietly, before turning and walking away. Marcus watched her retreat, feeling a sense of closure. This wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. The seeds of change had been planted, and now it was up to the passengers, and the airline itself, to nurture them. As the flight continued, Marcus leaned back in his seat, his thoughts a mixture of pride and resolve. He had spoken up, challenged assumptions, and made a difference, at least in one small corner of the world. And perhaps, just perhaps, this moment would spark a ripple effect. Maybe, in the future, when a black man or woman boarded a plane in first class, they wouldn't have to prove their worth. Maybe, they would simply be seen as someone who belonged there. And that would be a victory worth celebrating. A new beginning. The rest of the flight passed without incident. Marcus remained seated in the cramped economy section, but his mind was far from the discomfort of the narrow seat. He had done more than just endure the physical constraints of the cabin, he had made an impact. Not just on Sarah, the flight attendants, or the passengers who had witnessed the exchange, but on himself as well. The moment he stood up for himself, for his identity and his worth, had been a defining one, a reminder that the power to challenge injustice lies within each of us. As the plane cruised high above the clouds, the gentle vibrations of the seat and the occasional hum of the intercom became a backdrop to his thoughts. He hadn't intended to become a spokesperson for social change that day, but in a way, that's exactly what had happened. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction, a feeling that came not from solving a problem but from setting something into motion. It was nearing the end of the flight when Sarah approached him again. This time, her posture was different, more relaxed, less defensive. She had clearly thought a lot about their earlier conversation, and the way she carried herself now reflected that shift. "Captain Johnson," she began, her voice warm but respectful. "I just wanted to let you know that we've spoken to the crew. We're all on the same page now. I've also spoken to the captain of the flight, and he wanted me to personally thank you for your patience. He said it's not often someone takes the time to address these things so calmly." Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprised at the captain's involvement. "He did?" Sarah nodded. "Yes. He said he'd like to meet you before we land. He's heard your story before, about how you became a pilot, and he wants to thank you for showing such grace under pressure. He believes it's important for people to see the way you handled this." Marcus smiled, humbled by the unexpected recognition. "I appreciate that," he said simply. "But, honestly, it's not about being recognized. It's about making sure no one else ever has to face what I did today. Or if they do, that they have the courage to stand up and make it known that it's wrong." As Sarah walked away to make the final preparations for landing, Marcus felt a sense of finality begin to settle over him. The injustice of the earlier moment had been difficult to stomach, but it had sparked a conversation. It had made people look at their own biases and reconsider their assumptions. Maybe this wasn't just one small victory, it was a ripple, a shift in perspective that would stay with those on board for the rest of their lives. Perhaps it was even the beginning of something larger. The plane began its descent, and Marcus felt the familiar rush of anticipation that always came with the approach to the ground. But this time, the feeling was different. He wasn't just anticipating the end of a long flight. He was anticipating a new chapter in his journey, one that involved taking the lessons learned from this experience and using them to continue pushing forward. When the plane finally touched down in Los Angeles, Marcus could feel the tension in his shoulders release as the wheels hit the tarmac. The momentary jolt of landing was a reminder that they were no longer floating in the air, suspended between two worlds. This was the real world, the one where people carried the weight of their assumptions with them. But Marcus knew that this moment, and the journey that had brought him to it, had already begun to change things. After the plane had safely taxied to the gate, Marcus stood and began gathering his things. Sarah was waiting for him as he stepped into the aisle, and as he passed, she offered him a small smile. "Thank you for everything," she said quietly. "You've changed more than just the way I think about my job. You've changed the way I think about people." Marcus smiled in return, nodding his head slightly. "You're welcome. I hope you take what you've learned and share it with others. It's the only way we'll start seeing real change." As he made his way off the plane, he felt the eyes of the passengers on him once more. But this time, the looks weren't filled with confusion or judgment. They were filled with respect, and in some cases, even admiration. He could feel that people were thinking differently, and in that moment, he knew he had made a lasting impact. When Marcus reached the terminal and stepped into the busy airport, the rush of the crowd around him was almost overwhelming. But there was a sense of calm that he carried with him now, a sense of purpose. He had faced a moment of injustice and had transformed it into something meaningful. But it wasn't over. The world still had a long way to go, and Marcus knew that his mission, his true calling, was not just to be a pilot, but to continue challenging biases wherever he found them. He paused for a moment, looking out at the bustling airport through the large glass windows. People rushed by, each one absorbed in their own lives, their own struggles, their own victories. But he knew that some of them would remember the black man who had been asked to move to the back of the plane. They would remember the lesson in dignity and self-respect that they had witnessed. As he stepped out into the California sunshine, Marcus Johnson felt a quiet but unshakable sense of victory. The road ahead would be long, and there would be more battles to fight. But today, he had made a difference. He had shown that standing up for what is right wasn't just about taking a stand, it was about making sure that your actions left a mark on the hearts and minds of those around you. And as he walked through the airport, heading toward the baggage claim area, he knew that the ripple effect of his courage would continue to spread, one person at a time. In that moment, Marcus realized that sometimes, the greatest victories aren't won in the cockpit or in the skies, but on the ground, in the hearts of those who are brave enough to challenge the status quo. And today, that victory was his.